The snow fell without mercy. Margaret Ashford knelt in the frozen field behind her cottage, her hands already numb as she gathered the last armful of firewood. The winter of 1843 had come early to Derbyshire, brutal and unforgiving. 3 weeks of snow had buried the roads, isolated the farms, turned the world into nothing but white silence and bitter cold. She was about to turn back when she heard it. A sound that did not belong. Not the wind. Not an animal. A groan. Humans. Weak. Margaret dropped the firewood and ran toward the sound, her boots sinking deep into the drifts. Her breath came in clouds. The cold cut through her cloak like knives. Then she saw him. A man lay face down in the snow near the stone wall that marked the edge of her property. Dark coat. No hat. Blood stained the white ground beneath him, spreading slowly, too slowly, as if even his blood was freezing. Margaret fell to her knees beside him and turned him over with effort. He was heavy, tall, young, perhaps 30. His face was pale as death, his lips blue. A deep gash ran across his temple, still bleeding. His breathing came shallow and irregular. He was dying. She did not think. She could not afford to think. Margaret hooked her arms beneath his shoulders and pulled. He was far too heavy. She pulled again, dragging him inch by inch through the snow. Her muscles screamed. Her lungs burned with cold air. She did not stop. Not when her hands went numb. Not when she fell twice. Not when the cottage seemed impossibly far away. She would not let him die in the snow. Not while she still had strength. When she finally hauled him through the door of her cottage and collapsed beside him on the floor, gasping, trembling, covered in his blood and melting snow, Margaret Ashford did not know she had just saved the life of the most powerful man in England. She only knew she had saved a life, and that would change everything. If you cherish stories that whisper like old letters and echo with longing hearts, leave your like and subscribe. Your support allows these tales to reach more souls across the world. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always enchanting to discover how far our stories travel. Margaret Ashford was 27 years old, and she had learned long ago not to expect anything from the world. She was not beautiful, not in the way that mattered. Her features were plain. Strong nose, wide mouth, brown hair that refused to hold a curl. Her hands were rough from work. Her skin had been touched too often by sun and wind. She was the daughter of a gentleman once. Her father had been a country vicar with a small living and smaller income. When he died 5 years earlier, Margaret inherited nothing but debts and the tiny cottage on the edge of Lord Westmont's estate. She survived by working, mending, sewing, helping at harvest time, tending the sick when the village doctor was too far or too expensive. She asked for little and expected less. The villagers were kind enough. They paid her when they could. They left baskets of food at her door during lean months. But they also whispered, a woman alone at 27, unmarried, unwanted. She had been courted once years ago, a farmer's son. But when his mother learned Margaret had no dowry, the courtship ended. No explanation, no apology, just silence. Margaret learned to accept it, learned to live small, to ask for nothing, to be grateful for what little she had. Her cottage was simple. 1 room for living, 1 small bedroom, a fireplace that never quite kept out the cold. She owned 3 dresses, all mended many times. She had books, her father's books, worn and precious. She read them by candlelight on long winter nights. It was a small life, a quiet life, but it was hers, and she had learned to find peace in that. Until the day the stranger appeared in the snow. Margaret stripped away the man's frozen coat with shaking hands. The fabric was fine, too fine. Even soaked with snow and blood, she could feel the quality of the wool, the expert tailoring. This was not the coat of a farmer or tradesman. Beneath it, his shirt was linen, expensive linen. And beneath that, Margaret stopped. His chest was covered in bruises. Deep, violent bruises that spoke of impact, of being struck, of falling, or being thrown. She touched his forehead, burning hot despite the cold. Fever had already taken hold. Margaret worked quickly. She had tended the sick before. She knew what needed to be done. First, warmth. She built up the fire until it roared, filling the small cottage with heat. She dragged the man closer to the hearth, as close as she dared without risking burns. Then the wound. She fetched hot water, clean clothes, and the small bottle of spirits she kept for emergencies. She cleaned the gash on his temple with careful hands. It was deep. It would need stitches. Margaret threaded her needle with steady fingers. She had done this before, too. For her father once after a fall. For a neighbor's child who had cut himself on a scythe. She sewed the wound closed with small, precise stitches. The man did not wake, did not even flinch. That frightened her more than the blood. When she finished, she bandaged his head with strips of clean linen. Then she turned her attention to his wet clothes. She hesitated. It was improper, scandalous even, but he would die of cold if she left him in those frozen garments. Margaret drew a breath and began to undress him. His shirt came away damp and stained. His trousers followed. She tried not to look too closely and tried to maintain some shred of modesty. But she could not help noticing. He was strong, lean but muscular. His body carried the marks of a man who trained, who fought. There were scars, old ones, a long white line across his ribs, another on his shoulder. This was not a gentleman of leisure. This was a man who knew violence. Margaret covered him with every blanket she owned and her own cloak on top. She tucked them around him carefully, trying to give back the warmth the snow had stolen. Then she sat back, exhausted. The man lay unconscious by her fire. His breathing was shallow but steady. The bleeding had stopped. He was alive. For now. Margaret looked at his face properly for the first time. Even pale and wounded, there was something striking about him. Strong features. A firm jaw darkened with several days' growth of beard. Dark hair, nearly black, matted with blood and melting snow. Handsome, she realized. Very handsome. She pushed the thought away at once. It did not matter. He was a stranger. Wounded. Fevered. She had saved him because it was the right thing to do. Because leaving him to die in the snow would have been murder by neglect. When he woke, if he woke, he would leave. Return to wherever he had come from. She would never see him again. Margaret rose and went to the window. Outside, the snow fell harder now. The world had vanished into white. No one would be traveling in this. No one would come looking. She was alone with a dying man whose name she did not know. And for reasons she could not name, her heart would not stop racing. The fever worsened through the night. Margaret did not sleep. She could not. The man thrashed and muttered, lost in delirium. She knelt beside him, pressing cool clothes to his burning forehead, trying to keep him still so he would not tear his stitches. He spoke in fragments, names she did not recognize, orders delivered with the voice of authority. "Hold the line," he murmured. "Do not retreat. Do not." Military language. Margaret's heart sank. A soldier, then, perhaps one of Wellington's men, though the wars had been over for decades now. But the wars abroad had ended. What battle had this man been fighting? "My lord," he said suddenly, clearly. "My lord, you must listen." He fell silent again, his head turning restlessly on the folded blanket she had placed beneath him. Margaret changed the cloth. His fever showed no signs of breaking. She forced water between his lips, a few drops at a time. Most of it ran down his chin, but some he swallowed. It would have to be enough. The hours crawled past. Margaret fed the fire, changed the clothes, monitored his breathing, prayed. She had not prayed in a long time, not since her father died. But she prayed now. "Please," she whispered, "please do not let him die here. Not in my home. Not alone." Just before dawn, something changed. The man's eyes opened. Margaret froze. His eyes were gray, dark gray, like storm clouds. They stared up at the ceiling, unfocused, confused. "Where?" His voice came out rough, broken. Margaret leaned closer. "You're safe. You're in my cottage. I found you in the snow." His eyes moved to her face. For a moment he only stared, as though trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Who? He began, then stopped. His breathing quickened. I'm Margaret Ashford. You were injured. You have a fever. You need to rest. He tried to sit up. Margaret pushed him back down with surprising firmness. Do not move. You'll tear your stitches. He obeyed, but his eyes never left her face. How did I? He swallowed. How did I get here? I found you in the snow near my cottage. You were bleeding, freezing. I brought you inside. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, there was something new there. Fear. Did you see anyone else? Anyone nearby? Margaret shook her head. No one. The roads are impassable. I haven't seen another soul in days. Relief crossed his face. Or perhaps exhaustion. It was hard to tell. What is your name? Margaret asked gently. He hesitated. Too long. When he finally spoke, the name sounded false even to her untrained ear. John Smith. Margaret almost smiled despite herself. John Smith, the most common name in England. The name a man used when he did not want to give his real one. But she did not challenge him. Whatever he was hiding, whatever had brought him to her door half dead in the snow, it was not her concern. Mr. Smith, she said carefully, you have a fever. You need to rest. We can talk when you're stronger. He nodded, his eyes already drifting closed. Margaret watched as he slipped back into unconscious sleep. Not the violent delirium of fever, but something calmer. Healing sleep. She sat back, drawing a shaky breath. He had lied to her. She knew it. But she also knew something else. This man, whoever he truly was afraid. And Margaret had learned long ago that fear made people dangerous. 3 days passed before the fever finally broke. 3 days in which Margaret barely slept, barely ate. She tended the stranger. John Smith, she made herself call him, with a devotion that surprised even her. She changed his bandages, fed him broth, spoonful by spoonful, when he was conscious enough to swallow. Bathed his face and chest with cool water when the fever raged. On the second night, when his fever spiked dangerously high, she did something she had not done since nursing her father through his final illness. She lay down beside him, not from desire, not from impropriety, from necessity. He was shaking so violently the blankets could not help him. So Margaret pressed her body against his, lending him her warmth, trying to still the tremors that racked his frame. He turned into her instinctively, burying his face against her neck. His arms came around her weakly. He murmured something she could not understand. Margaret held him, stroked his hair, whispered meaningless comfort. You're safe. I have you. You're safe. She felt his breathing slow, felt the shaking ease, and something shifted inside her chest. Something dangerous. This man was not hers, would never be hers. When he recovered, he would leave, return to his life, whatever that life was. She was only the woman who had happened to find him. Nothing more. But lying there in the firelight, holding him as though he were something precious, Margaret felt a longing so acute it hurt. When had anyone last held her? When had anyone last needed her, truly needed her, the way this man needed her now? She pushed the thought away. This was temporary. This meant nothing. But she did not let him go. By the third morning, the fever broke. Margaret woke to find the stranger watching her. She was still lying beside him, her head on his shoulder, their bodies tangled together beneath the blankets. She sat up at once, heat flooding her face. I'm sorry, she said quickly. You were shaking. The fever. I was only trying to. Thank you. The words stopped her. She looked at him. His gray eyes were clear now, lucid. There was something in them she could not name. Gratitude, yes, but something else. Something that made her heart beat too fast. You saved my life, he said quietly. Didn't you? Margaret smoothed her dress, trying to regain composure. You were dying. I did what anyone would have done. No. His voice was firm. Not anyone. Most would have left me in the snow. She met his eyes. I could not do that. Why not? The question caught her off guard. Why? Because it would have been wrong. Because she had been taught to help those in need. Because I am not the kind of person who lets people die when I can prevent it. Something crossed his face. Respect, perhaps. Or shame. What happened to you? Margaret asked. How did you come to be in the snow like that? He looked away. I was traveling. There was an accident. My horse threw me. Another lie. Margaret could hear it in his voice. But she did not press. Can you sit up? She asked instead. You should try to eat something. He nodded. With Margaret's help, he managed to sit propped against the wall. She brought him broth and bread. He ate slowly, as though even that small effort exhausted him. You live alone here? He asked between careful bites. I do. No husband. No. Family. None living. He frowned. And yet you took in a stranger. A man you do not know. That was dangerous. Margaret almost smiled. You were half dead. I did not think you posed much threat. Still, you could not have known what I might do when I woke up. She met his eyes steadily. No, I could not. But I chose to believe you were worth saving. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, I hope you are right. The stranger grew stronger. By the 5th day he could walk without support. By the 7th, he insisted on helping with the small tasks of the cottage. Feeding the fire, fetching water from the well, splitting wood. Margaret protested at first. You're still recovering. You need to rest. But he was stubborn. I have imposed on your hospitality long enough. The least I can do is contribute. So she allowed it. And slowly a routine formed between them. They rose with the sun. Margaret prepared simple meals, porridge, bread, whatever vegetables she had preserved from autumn. The stranger, she still thought of him that way, despite his insistence on being called John, ate with quiet gratitude, never complaining about the plainness of the food. During the day he worked. Margaret watched him from the window as he split wood in the yard. His movements still careful but growing stronger. He had borrowed one of her father's old shirts. It fit poorly, too tight across the shoulders, but he wore it without complaint. In the evenings they sat by the fire. Margaret mended clothes. The stranger read from her father's small collection of books, his long fingers turning pages with surprising gentleness. Sometimes they talked. You read Greek? Margaret asked one evening, surprised to see him absorbed in one of her father's classical texts. He looked up, a faint smile touching his lips. I was well educated. Once. Before I became no one. It was the most honest thing he had said since arriving. Margaret set down her mending. You are not no one, even if you will not tell me your real name. He closed the book. Would knowing my name change anything? It might help me understand why you were dying in the snow. He was quiet for a long time. Then, I was running. From what? From people who want me dead. The words fell like stones into still water. Margaret felt cold despite the fire. Are you a criminal? No. He met her eyes. But I have enemies. Powerful ones. And if they knew where I was... He stopped. It would be dangerous. For me. And for anyone sheltering me. Margaret's throat tightened. Should I be afraid of you? No. Never. The word came out fierce. I will die before I let harm come to you. The conviction in his voice startled her. This man barely knew her, and yet he spoke with the certainty of an oath. Why? She whispered. Because you saved me. Because you showed me kindness when you had no reason to. Because... He stopped. I looked away. Because you deserve better than fear. Margaret did not know what to say, so she said nothing. But something had shifted. The walls between them had cracked. Later that night, Margaret lay in her small bedroom and stared at the ceiling. In the other room, the stranger slept by the fire. She could hear his steady breathing through the thin wall. She thought of his hands. Strong hands, but gentle when he took a cup from her. She thought of his voice, educated but careful, as though he was used to being heard and obeyed. She thought of the way he watched her when he thought she was not looking, with something that might have been longing. This man was not John Smith. He was someone important, someone with enemies, someone accustomed to power. And he was hiding in her cottage, dependent on her kindness, her silence. Margaret pressed her hands to her face. She was being foolish, dangerously foolish, because somewhere along the way, between the fever dreams and the shared meals and the quiet evenings by the fire, she had begun to care for him, not as a patient, as a man. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The snow finally stopped on the 10th day. Margaret woke to pale sunlight streaming through the window. Real sunlight, not the diffused glow through heavy clouds. She rose and opened the door. The world was white and still, but the sky was clear. Blue. Beautiful. The roads would be passable soon. Within days. Which meant the stranger would leave. The thought struck her with unexpected force. She leaned against the doorframe, drawing cold air into her lungs. He would leave. Return to his life. She would never see him again. She had known this from the beginning. She had told herself she was prepared. But she was not prepared. Not at all. It's beautiful. Margaret turned. The stranger stood behind her, still wearing her father's ill-fitting shirt and borrowed trousers. His hair was longer now, dark and slightly wild. The bandage was gone from his head, revealing the healing wound at his temple. A thin red line that would scar. Yes, she managed. The storm has passed. He stepped up beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. The roads will clear soon. Yes. Silence. Heavy with everything unsaid. Margaret. He said her name carefully, as though testing its weight. I need to tell you something. Her heart beat too fast. What? He drew a breath. My name is not John Smith. I know. He looked at her, surprised. You knew. You are a terrible liar. A faint smile touched her lips despite the ache in her chest. But I assumed you had your reasons. I did. I do. He ran a hand through his hair. There are people looking for me. If they found me here, if they knew you had sheltered me, they would hurt you. Yes, they might. He stopped. I turned to face her fully. They might try to use you against me. And I could not bear that. Margaret's breath caught. Why would they use me against you? He looked at her with such intensity it stole the air from her lungs. Because you matter, he said quietly. You matter to me, more than is wise, more than I have any right to feel. The words hung between them. Confession, warning, truth. Margaret's hands trembled. You do not know me. Not truly. I know that you saved my life without asking who I was. I know that you sat up 3 nights nursing a stranger through fever. I know that you shared your last loaf of bread without hesitation. I know. His voice roughened. I know that I have never met anyone with a kinder heart. Tears stung Margaret's eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her as though she were something precious. You are someone important, she whispered. Are you not? Someone powerful. He did not deny it. I was. Once. Now I am only a man trying to stay alive long enough to reclaim what was taken from me. What was taken? He hesitated. Then, everything. My title. My estate. My name. All of it was stolen by someone I trusted. Margaret's mind raced. Title. Estate. She had suspected he was a nobility. But to have everything stolen. Are you? She could barely form the words. Are you a lord? Yes. The word came out heavy. Final. I am. Or I was. I do not know any more what I am entitled to call myself. Margaret stepped back. The distance felt necessary. Safe. Tell me, she said. Tell me the truth. All of it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. And he began to speak. My name is Alexander Hartley. was the Duke of Ashbourne. Margaret's legs weakened. She reached for the doorframe. A duke. She had been nursing a duke. Ashbourne, she repeated faintly. One of the oldest titles in England. One of the wealthiest estates. Alexander watched her face carefully. Does that change how you see me? Margaret did not know how to answer. You are a duke, and I am no one. How could that not change everything? You are not no one. He stepped closer, his voice fierce. You are Margaret Ashford. You are the woman who saved my life. The woman who showed me more genuine kindness in 10 days than I have known in years of privilege. Why are you here? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why were you dying in the snow? Alexander's jaw tightened. Because my cousin tried to kill me. The words fell like an executioner's blade. Your cousin, Richard Hartley. He stands to inherit everything if I die. The title, the estates, the fortune. All of it. Alexander turned away, staring out at the snow. I discovered he was embezzling from the estate. Tens of thousands of pounds. I confronted him, told him I would expose him unless he made restitution. And he tried to kill you. Yes, he hired men to ambush me on the road. They attacked my carriage 3 weeks ago, killed my driver, beat me, left me for dead in a ravine. His voice went flat. I survived. Barely. I have been running ever since, staying off the main roads, using false names. And then the storm came, and I knew I could not go any further. I thought I would die out there. He turned back to her. And then you found me. Margaret pressed her hands together. Does anyone know you are alive? No. Richard believes he succeeded. By now he has likely already claimed the title. Moved into Ashbourne House. Take control of everything. Then you need to go to London. To the authorities. Expose him. I have no proof. The men he hired are long gone. It is my word against his. Alexander's hands clenched into fists. And Richard has allies. Powerful friends. If I show myself without evidence, without protection, he will simply finish what he started. Then what will you do? Alexander met her eyes. I do not know. I only know that I cannot stay here much longer. The longer I remain, the greater the danger to you. I am not afraid. You should be. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides. Margaret, you do not understand. If Richard discovers you sheltered me, he will destroy you. He will accuse you of conspiracy, theft, anything he can think of. You would lose everything. This cottage, your reputation, your freedom. Then we must make sure he never finds out. Alexander stared at her. You still want to help me? After knowing who I am? After knowing the danger? Yes. Margaret lifted her chin. Because what your cousin did was wrong. Because you deserve justice. And because, she stopped. Because, Alexander prompted softly. Margaret drew a shaky breath. Because in these 10 days, you have been kinder to me than anyone in my entire life. You have treated me as an equal. You listened when I spoke. You have looked at me as though I matter. Her voice broke. No one has ever made me feel the way you have made me feel. Alexander's eyes darkened. Margaret, I know it is foolish, she continued, the words tumbling out now. I know that you are a duke and I am nothing. I know that when you leave, you will return to your world and I will never see you again. But for these 10 days I have been happy, and I will not regret that, whatever comes after. Alexander cupped her face in his hands. The gesture was so gentle, so reverent, that Margaret felt tears slide down her cheeks. You are not nothing, he said hoarsely. You are everything. And if I survive this, if I reclaim what was stolen from me, I swear to you, I will come back. I will find you, and I will prove to you that these 10 days mattered to me as much as they did to you. You do not have to. Yes, I do. He brushed away her tears with his thumbs. Because you deserve more than being forgotten. You deserve more than a life of loneliness in this cottage. You deserve to be seen, to be valued, to be. He stopped, swallowed hard. To be loved, he finished quietly. Margaret's breath caught. Alexander leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. I will come back for you. I swear it. And Margaret, despite every warning her practical mind screamed, chose to believe him. 2 days later, the roads were clear enough to travel. Alexander stood in the small cottage, dressed once more in his own clothes, cleaned and mended by Margaret's careful hands. He looked like a duke again, polished, powerful, remote. Margaret felt the distance between them like a physical thing. "You do not have to do this," she said for the third time. "You could stay. Wait until you are stronger. If I wait, Richard will have time to solidify his position. The longer I delay, the harder it will be to challenge him." Alexander checked the saddlebag one final time. Margaret had given him what little food she could spare. "I need to reach London, find allies, build a case. And then I expose him for what he is, a thief and a murderer." Margaret twisted her hands together. "What if he finds you first?" "He will not. You do not know that." Alexander turned to face her. "Margaret, I have to try. If I do not, he wins. He takes everything. And he stopped. "I will not let him have everything. Not this time." She understood what he meant. Not just the title. Not just the money. His life. His honor. His future. Her. "How long?" Margaret whispered. "I do not know. Weeks. Perhaps months. And if you do not succeed, I will succeed." Alexander took her hands in his. "Because I have something worth fighting for now. Someone worth surviving for." Margaret's throat ached. "You should not make promises you cannot keep." "Then I will keep this one." He brought her hands to his lips and kissed them with a gentleness that broke her heart. "Wait for me, Margaret. Please, wait for me." She wanted to say yes. Wanted to believe that a duke would return for a vicar's daughter. That titles and social barriers did not matter. But she had lived in the world too long to be that naive. "I will wait," she said anyway, because hope, however foolish, was better than despair. "But not forever. I will not ask forever. Only until I can make things right." He kissed her then. Slow and sweet and devastating. Margaret melted into him, memorizing the taste of him, the feel of his arms around her, the way her heart raced when he held her close. When they finally parted, both were breathing hard. "Go," Margaret whispered, "before I beg you to stay." Alexander touched her face one last time. "I will come back. I swear on it in my life." Then he walked out the door. Margaret stood on the threshold and watched him ride away through the snow. He turned back once, only once, and raised his hand in farewell. Then the trees swallowed him and he was gone. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it. The cottage felt empty, impossibly empty. She had been alone before. She knew how to survive loneliness. But this was different. This was the absence of something she had never had before. Something she might never have again. Margaret walked to the window and pressed her hand against the cold glass. "Come back," she whispered to the empty white world. "Please come back." But the only answer was silence. The weeks that followed were the longest of Margaret's life. She returned to her routine. Mending, sewing, helping in the village when she was needed. The snow melted. Spring began to creep across the fields in tentative greens and shy flowers. But everything felt hollow. The cottage was too quiet. She found herself turning to speak to Alexander, only to remember he was not there. She cooked for 2 out of habit, then sat alone at her small table, staring at the empty chair across from her. At night, she lay in her narrow bed and remembered the feeling of his arms around her, the warmth of his body pressed against hers, the way he had looked at her as though she were something precious. She wondered if he had reached London safely. She wondered if he had found allies. She wondered if he was even still alive. No word came, no message, no sign. Margaret told herself it was too soon, that these things took time, that he would send word as soon as he was able. But doubt crept in like frost. Perhaps he had forgotten her. Perhaps, back in his own world, surrounded by wealth and power and beautiful women of his own class, he had realized how foolish it had been to make promises to a plain vicar's daughter. Perhaps the 10 days in her cottage had been nothing more than an aberration, a brief respite from his real life. Margaret tried not to think these thoughts, but they came anyway, especially in the dark hours before dawn. She was nobody. She had always been nobody. Why would a duke remember someone like her? One morning, as she was walking back from the village with a basket of eggs, she encountered Mrs. Pemberton, the vicar's wife. a kind woman who had known Margaret's father. "My dear," Mrs. Pemberton said, studying her with concern. "You look so thin. Are you eating properly?" Margaret forced a smile. "I am well, Mrs. Pemberton. Only tired. You work too hard. A young woman should not be alone as you are." She hesitated. "Mr. Fletcher's nephew is visiting from Derby. A very respectable young man. A clerk. Perhaps you might join us for tea? I could introduce you." Margaret's stomach twisted. Mr. Fletcher's nephew. A clerk. A respectable match for a vicar's daughter. Not a duke. Never a duke. "That is very kind," Margaret said carefully. "But I am not. I am not looking to marry at present." Mrs. Pemberton's expression turned pitying. "My dear, you cannot wait forever for a miracle. You are 27. You have no family, no fortune. At some point, you must be practical." The words stung. Not because they were cruel, Mrs. Pemberton meant well, but because they were true. "I know," Margaret said quietly. "I do know." She walked home with tears burning in her eyes. Mrs. Pemberton was right. She needed to be practical. She needed to let go of foolish dreams. Alexander was not coming back. And even if he did, what then? Did she truly believe he would marry her? A duke marries a nobody? It was absurd. Impossible. Margaret set down her basket and sank into the chair by the cold fireplace. She had been a fool. A romantic fool who had allowed herself to believe in fairy tales. But she was not a child. She was a grown woman who knew how the world worked. And the world did not give happy endings to women like her. Margaret buried her face in her hands. She would wait a little longer. Another few weeks. Perhaps a month. And then she would accept that he was gone. She would accept that those 10 days had been nothing more than a beautiful dream. And she would learn once again to live alone. 6 weeks after Alexander left, the rumors reached the village. The Duke of Ashbourne was dead. Margaret heard it first from the baker's wife, who had heard it from a traveling merchant, who had heard it from someone in London. There had been a fire at Ashbourne House. The new Duke, Richard Hartley, had barely escaped with his life. But his predecessor, the former Duke Alexander Hartley, who had briefly reappeared to contest the succession, had perished in the flames. Margaret felt the world tilt. She gripped the counter of the baker's shop, her vision swimming. "Are you all right, Miss Ashford?" the baker's wife asked with concern. "You've gone quite pale." "Ah, yes, I am fine." Margaret forced the words past numb lips. "Excuse me." She walked out into the street. The spring sun was bright. Too bright. Everything was too bright and too loud and too real. Alexander was dead. He had reached London. He had challenged Richard. And Richard had killed him. Margaret made it to the edge of the village before her legs gave out. She sank down onto a low stone wall, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. He was gone. She would never see him again. Never hear his voice. Never feel his arms around her. All those weeks of waiting, of hoping, of believing he would come back. For nothing. Margaret did not cry. The grief was too large for tears. It sat in her chest like a stone, cold and heavy and suffocating. She sat there for a long time. The sun moved across the sky. Villagers passed. Some greeted her. She did not respond. Finally, as the light began to fade, Margaret rose. She walked back to her cottage like a ghost. Inside, everything looked exactly as it had. The chair where Alexander had sat. The books he had read. The corner where he had slept by the fire. Margaret touched the chair back. Her fingers trembled. He had sat here. He had been alive. Real. He had promised to come back. And now he is gone. Forever. Margaret sank down onto the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. And finally, she wept. She wept for the loss of him. For the brief, shining happiness of those 10 days. For the future that would never be. She wept until she had no tears left. Until she was hollow and empty and numb. And then, as night fell, Margaret made a decision. She would survive this. As she had survived her father's death. As she had survived loneliness and poverty and being overlooked her entire life. She would survive. But she would never open her heart again. Never allow herself to hope. Never allow herself to believe in promises. It hurt too much, and she was tired of hurting. Margaret rose on unsteady legs. She went to her bedroom. She undressed and lay down in the narrow bed. Outside, the spring night was beautiful. Stars filled the sky. The air smelled of flowers and new grass. But Margaret saw none of it. I felt none of it. She closed her eyes and waited for sleep that would not come. And she tried not to remember the feeling of Alexander's arms around her. The sound of his voice saying her name. The impossible promise he had made. I will come back. But he had not come back. He never would. And Margaret was alone. Again. 3 days after the news of Alexander's death reached the village, Margaret woke to the sound of hooves. She lay in bed, listening. It was barely dawn. Who would be riding at this hour? The hoofbeats stopped. Outside her cottage, Margaret's heart began to race. Fear, not hope. Richard hardly knew. He had discovered that Alexander had sheltered here. He had come to silence her. She rose quickly, grabbed the heaviest candlestick she owned, and went to the door. A knock. Firm. Authoritative. Margaret drew a breath and opened the door, then dropped the candlestick. Alexander stood on her threshold. Alive. Whole. Real. His face was thinner. There were new shadows under his eyes. But he was breathing. Standing. Looking at her with an expression that made her heart stop. Margaret, he said hoarsely. She could not speak. Could not move. May I come in? He asked softly. Margaret stepped back. Alexander entered. He closed the door behind him. They stood in the dim cottage, staring at each other. You are dead, Margaret whispered. The fire, everyone said. I know what everyone said. Alexander took a careful step closer. It was necessary. Richard had to believe I died in that fire. It was the only way. The only way to what? To trap him. Margaret sank into a chair. Her legs would not hold her. I do not understand. Alexander knelt in front of her. When I reached London, I found allies. Men who had been suspicious of Richard for years. We built a case. I gathered evidence. But Richard was too careful. Every crime he committed was hidden behind intermediaries and false names. He took her hands. So we set a trap. We let him believe I was contesting the title. We arranged a meeting at Ashbourne House. And when Richard tried to kill me again, when he set the fire, we had witnesses. Men hidden throughout the house. They saw everything. And you? I escaped through a servant's passage. We had planned it in advance. But to the world, to Richard, the Duke of Ashbourne died in that fire. Margaret's mind raced. So Richard is arrested? Yes, charged with murder, embezzlement, conspiracy. He will hang. Alexander's voice was flat. Final. It is over. Then why? Margaret pulled her hands free. Why did you not send a word? Why did you let me believe you were dead? Pain flashed across Alexander's face. Because I could not risk any communication. Richard had spies everywhere. If anyone suspected I was alive, if anyone connected me to you, you would have been in danger. So you let me grieve. Anger surged through Margaret's exhaustion. You let me believe you were gone. Do you have any idea? Her voice broke. Do you have any idea what these past weeks have been like? I know. And I am sorry. Alexander reached for her again. Margaret, I am so sorry. She stood abruptly, putting distance between them. Why are you here? What do you want? I want. He rose slowly. I came to keep my promise. Your promise. I told you I would come back. I told you I would find you. He took a step toward her. Margaret, I have spent 6 weeks in hell, building the case against Richard, arranging his downfall, and through all of it, the only thing that kept me sane was the thought of you, of coming back here, of seeing you again. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself. You are a duke again. You have your title, your estate, your life. Why would you come back for someone like me? Because I love you. The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Margaret stared at him. You do not mean that. I do. Alexander crossed the room. I love you, Margaret Ashford. I love your kindness, your strength, your quiet courage. I love the way you saved my life without asking for anything in return. I love the way you looked at me as though I were simply a man, not a title. He cupped her face in his hands. I love you, and I am asking, begging, for the chance to prove it. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I am nobody, a vicar's daughter with no fortune, no beauty, no. You are everything. Alexander's voice was fierce. You are the woman I want, the only woman I have ever wanted. And if you will have me, if you will marry me, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt your worth again. Margaret's breath caught. Marry you? Yes. He smiled, small and uncertain. Marry me, be my duchess. Not because of the title, not because of duty, but because I cannot imagine living another day without you. Alexander, I know the world will talk. I know society will judge. A duke marrying a woman with no connections, no fortune. His thumbs brushed away her tears. But I do not care. Let them talk. Let them judge. You are the one I choose. The only one I will ever choose. Margaret looked at him. The man who had lived in her cottage fevers and dyes. Who had read her father's books and split her firewood. Who had held her as though she were precious. Who had come back. Yes, she whispered. Alexander went still. Yes, yes, I will marry you. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. You will. Margaret laughed through her tears. I will. You impossible, stubborn, wonderful man. Yes. Alexander pulled her into his arms and kissed her. Deep and thorough and devastating. Margaret kissed him back, pouring 6 weeks of grief and fear and longing into it. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. When? Margaret asked. As soon as possible. Alexander rested his forehead against hers. I have waited long enough. We both have. There will be scandal. I do not care. Society will shun us. Then society is made of fools. He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. Margaret, I am asking you to leave this cottage, to leave this village, to come with me to a world that may not welcome you. Are you certain? Margaret thought of the years of loneliness, of being overlooked and forgotten, of believing she would always be invisible. And then she thought of Alexander, of the way he looked at her, of the promise in his eyes. I am certain, she said. As long as I am with you, I can face anything. Alexander kissed her again, gentler this time, promise sealed. Then let us go home, he murmured against her lips. Together. Alexander did not wait. 3 days after his return, he and Margaret stood before the village vicar and were married in a simple ceremony. Mrs. Pemberton attended, her face a mask of shock. The baker's wife whispered furiously to her husband throughout. Margaret wore her best dress. A simple blue cotton that Alexander insisted was perfect. He wore formal clothes that marked him unmistakably as what he was. A duke. The contrast was stark. Impossible to miss. When the vicar asked if anyone objected, Margaret held her breath. Silence. Then Alexander slid a gold ring onto her finger and spoke the words that bound them forever. They left for London the next morning. The journey took 2 days. Alexander hired a comfortable carriage and treated Margaret with a gentleness that made her heart ache. He held her hand, pointed out landmarks, told her stories of Ashbourne House. It is very large, he warned, very formal. There are servants everywhere. It may be overwhelming at first. I will manage, Margaret said, though her stomach twisted with nerves. I know you will. He kissed her hand. And Margaret? The servants answer to you now. You are the Duchess of Ashbourne. They will address you as Your Grace. You need not be afraid of them. Your Grace. Margaret tried the title on in her mind. Felt absurd. Foreign. But Alexander said it with such confidence that she tried to believe him. When they finally arrived at Ashbourne House, Margaret's breath caught. It was enormous. A sprawling estate of golden stone with formal gardens stretching in every direction. Servants lined the entrance, dozens of them, all dressed in livery. Margaret felt sick. "Alexander," she whispered, "I cannot do this." "Yes, you can." He helped her down from the carriage and tucked her hand through his arm. "You saved my life, Margaret. If you can do that, you can do anything." They walked up the steps together. An elderly man in butler's livery bowed deeply. "Your Grace. Welcome home." "Thank you, Whitmore." Alexander's voice was calm, authoritative. "This is my wife, the Duchess of Ashbourne. You will extend to her every courtesy and obedience." Whitmore's eyes widened fractionally. Then he bowed to Margaret. "Your Grace. Welcome to Ashbourne House." Margaret managed a nod. "Thank you." They entered the house. Margaret tried not to stare. The entrance hall alone was larger than her entire cottage. Marble floors, soaring ceilings, paintings that looked centuries old. She did not belong here. Alexander must have sensed her panic. He leaned close. "Breathe. You are home now." But it did not feel like home. It felt like a museum. A beautiful, cold, impossible place. That evening, Margaret stood in the Duchess's chambers, her chambers now, and stared at herself in the mirror. A lady's maid had helped her dress for dinner. The gown was silk, deep green, beautifully cut. It must have cost more than Margaret had earned in her entire life. She looked like someone else, someone who belonged in a duke's house. But inside, she was still Margaret Ashford. Plain, ordinary, invisible. A knock at the door. Alexander entered, stopping when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said softly. Margaret shook her head. "I look like I am playing dress-up." Alexander crossed to her. "You look like a duchess. My duchess." "Alexander, I do not know how to do this." Margaret turned to face him. "I do not know how to manage a house this size. How to navigate society. How to." "You do not need to know everything at once." He took her hands. "Learn as you go. Ask questions. The staff will help you. And I will be beside you every step. And when society discovers who I am, where did I come from?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Then they will learn to accept it. Because I will not hide you, Margaret. I will not pretend you are anything other than what you are. The woman I love. The woman I chose." Margaret wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that love would be enough. But she had lived in the world too long to be naive. Still, when Alexander pulled her into his arms, when he held her as though she were something infinitely precious, she allowed herself to hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could learn to belong here. Not as the invisible vicar's daughter, but as the Duchess of Ashbourne, Alexander's wife, his equal. The first blow came within a week. Margaret was in the morning room, attempting to review the household accounts, when Whitmore entered with a silver tray. "Your Grace, correspondence." Margaret took the letters with trembling hands. 3 invitations. For cards. All from prominent families. She opened the first invitation with hope. It was a formal note declining a future meeting. Regrets that previous engagements made it impossible to accept the Duchess of Ashbourne's invitation to tea. The second was similar. Polite, cold. The third was not even polite. Lady Pembroke regrets that she cannot in good conscience associate with persons of questionable origin. Margaret set the letters down carefully. Her hands shook. Questionable origin. She was not good enough. Not for them. Not for this world. Alexander found her an hour later, still sitting in the morning room, staring at nothing. "Margaret!" He knelt beside her chair. "What is it?" Silently, she handed him the letters. Alexander read them. His expression darkened with each word. "This is unacceptable," he said flatly. "It is honest." Margaret's voice came out hollow. "They do not want me, Alexander. They do not want a duchess who was nobody before she married you. Then they are fools. They are society. They are the world you belong to." Margaret looked at him. "Perhaps they are right. Perhaps I do not belong here." "No." Alexander's voice was fierce. "Do not let them make you doubt your worth. These people," he gestured at the letters, "these people judge worth by birth and money. They know nothing of real value. of character, of kindness. But you need them, do you not? You need their support, their alliances. Alexander was quiet for a moment. Then, I need you more. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You should not have to choose. I am not choosing. I chose you the moment I promised to return. And I will choose you every day for the rest of my life, no matter who objects. He pulled her into his arms. Margaret buried her face against his chest and tried to believe him. But the letters kept coming. Week after week. Polite refusals. Thinly veiled insults. Invitations withdrawn. Margaret was being shut out. Excluded from the world she was supposed to inhabit as Alexander's wife. The servants noticed. Margaret could see it in their careful expressions. The way they spoke to her with exaggerated respect, as though trying to compensate for the way society treated her. It was humiliating. One afternoon, as Margaret was walking in the garden, she encountered the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, Alexander's aunt, Lady Catherine. The woman was formidable. Tall, elegant, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. "So you are the new Duchess," Lady Catherine said without preamble. Margaret curtsied. "Your Grace, my nephew married you in some village ceremony without informing the family, without considering the consequences." Lady Catherine studied her with cool assessment. "You must know what people are saying." "I do. And yet you remain." Margaret lifted her chin. "I am Alexander's wife. This is my home now." Lady Catherine's eyebrow arched. "Is it? Can you manage an estate this size? Navigate London society? Host dinners for ambassadors and ministers? Or will you embarrass him at every turn?" The words struck like physical blows. "I am learning," Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Learning is not enough. Being a duchess requires breeding, training, connections you do not possess." Lady Catherine stepped closer. "My nephew is a romantic fool. He married you out of gratitude and infatuation. But gratitude fades. Infatuation dies. And when it does, he will realize his mistake." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. "If you truly care for him," Lady Catherine continued, her voice almost kind, "you will leave, make some excuses, annul the marriage, free him to marry someone suitable." "No." The word came out stronger than Margaret expected. "No, I will not leave him. I will not abandon our marriage because society judges me unworthy." Margaret met Lady Catherine's eyes. "Alexander chose me, and I chose him. Whatever comes, we will face it together." Lady Catherine studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she smiled. Faint but real. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "you are stronger than I thought." She walked away without another word. Margaret stood in the garden, shaking. But she had not backed down. She had stood her ground. And somehow that felt like victory. The test came at the Duchess of Marlborough's ball. It was the event of the season. Everyone who mattered would attend. And the Duchess of Marlborough, despite her disapproval of Alexander's marriage, could not refuse to invite him without causing a scandal. The invitation included Margaret. "We do not have to go," Alexander said when it arrived. "If you would rather not face them." "No." Margaret's voice was steady. "We are going." She would not hide. Would not let society's judgment turn her into a coward. The night of the ball, Margaret dressed with meticulous care. The gown was emerald silk, cut in the latest fashion. Her hair was arranged in an elegant style. Diamonds, Alexander's late mother's diamonds, glittered at her throat and ears. She looked like a duchess. But her hands trembled as the carriage rolled toward Marlborough House. "You are terrified," Alexander observed gently. "Yes. We can leave at any time. Say the word, and we go." Margaret shook her head. "We stay. We face them." Alexander took her hand and kissed it. "You are the bravest person I know." They entered Marlborough House together. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over hundreds of guests in their finest clothes. Music played. Champagne flowed. And when the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne were announced, the room went silent. Margaret felt every eye turn toward them, felt the weight of judgment, of curiosity, of barely concealed disdain. Alexander tucked her hand more firmly through his arm. "Head high," he murmured. They descended the stairs into the ballroom. Whispers followed them. Margaret caught fragments. "That is her. Plain thing, is she not? What was he thinking? Some vicar's daughter, I heard." Alexander ignored it all. He led Margaret directly to the Duchess of Marlborough, a handsome woman in her 50s with an expression of polite frost. "Your Grace," Alexander said smoothly. "Thank you for the invitation. May I present my wife, the Duchess of Ashbourne?" Margaret curtsied. "Your Grace, thank you for receiving us." The Duchess of Marlborough's eyes were cold. "Duke Ashbourne, we are pleased you could attend." She did not acknowledge Margaret further. The cut was deliberate, public. Margaret felt heat flood her face. Around them people watched, waited to see how she would react. Then Alexander did something unexpected. He turned his back on the Duchess of Marlborough and faced the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom, "I would like to formally introduce my wife, Margaret, Duchess of Ashbourne." He drew Margaret forward. She stood beside him, heart pounding, as hundreds of eyes fixed on them. "Some of you," Alexander continued, his tone pleasant but edged with steel, "have made your disapproval of my marriage known. You believe my wife is not suitable because she was not born into your circles, because she has no title, no fortune, no connections." The silence was absolute. "You are right," Alexander said. "She had none of those things. What she did have was the courage to save my life when I was dying, the kindness to nurse a stranger through fever, the strength to survive alone with grace and dignity." He turned to Margaret, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "She is the finest person I have ever known, and I am honored, that she chose to marry me." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it. The gesture was deliberate, public, acclaiming. "If you cannot accept her," Alexander said, turning back to the crowd, "then you cannot accept me. The choice is yours." The silence stretched. Then, from the back of the ballroom, someone began to clap. Lady Catherine, the Dowager Duchess, stood alone, applauding slowly. One by one, others joined, hesitant at first, then growing. Not everyone, but enough. The Duchess of Marlborough's expression was tight, but she inclined her head. "Welcome, Duchess Ashbourne." It was not warm, but it was an acknowledgement. Alexander led Margaret onto the dance floor. He took her in his arms, and they waltzed. "That was reckless," Margaret whispered. "That was necessary." Alexander smiled down at her. "I will not have you treated as less than you are. Not by anyone. You may have made powerful enemies tonight. Then I will face them." He pulled her closer. "With you." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. The fear, the doubt, the certainty that she did not belong. It was still there, but it was smaller now, because Alexander had stood beside her, had claimed her publicly, had made it clear to everyone present that she was not a mistake. She was his choice. And that was enough. Ashbourne House, spring 1845. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of a baby crying. She rose at once, wrapping a shawl around her nightgown, and padded across the room to the cradle. Her daughter, Eleanor, waved tiny fists in the air, her face red with indignation. "Hush, little one," Margaret murmured, lifting her. "You will wake your father." "Too late," Alexander said from the bed, his voice rough with sleep. "I am already awake." He sat up, hair disheveled, looking nothing like the polished duke who had faced down society a year ago. Margaret loved him like this, unguarded, real. Eleanor stopped crying the moment she was in her mother's arms. Margaret settled into the chair by the window and began to nurse her. Alexander joined her, kneeling beside the chair. He touched Eleanor's soft dark hair with infinite gentleness. "She has your eyes," Margaret said softly. "And your stubbornness," Alexander replied with a smile. Margaret laughed. Over the past year, she had learned to laugh again, to feel safe, to believe that she truly belonged here. It has not been easy. Society's acceptance had come slowly, grudgingly. There were still those who whispered, who looked down on the Duchess with no pedigree. But there were also those who respected her, who saw her competence in managing Ashbourne's charitable works, who recognized her quiet dignity. And most importantly, there was Alexander. He had kept every promise, stood beside her through every difficulty, loved her with a constant that still took her breath away. "What are you thinking?" Alexander asked, studying her face. "That I am happy," Margaret said simply. "That I never thought I could be this happy." Alexander cupped her face in his hand. "You deserve happiness. You always did. So do you." "I am happy." He leaned forward and kissed her softly. "Every day with you is a gift." Eleanor finished nursing and drifted into milk-drunk sleep. Margaret handed her to Alexander, who cradled her with practiced ease. "I received a letter from Mrs. Pemberton yesterday," Margaret said. "From the village." "Oh." "She wrote to tell me that the cottage has a new tenant, a young widow who needed a home." Alexander smiled. "You arranged that, didn't you?" The cottage was sitting empty. It seemed wasteful. "You are giving it away for free, are you not? Charging no rent." Margaret did not deny it. "She needs help. I remember what that was like." Alexander set Eleanor in her cradle and pulled Margaret into his arms. "This is why I love you," he said against her hair. "Your heart, your kindness, the way you never forgot where you came from." Margaret leaned into him. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is my life, that I am here, that you are real." "I am very real." Alexander kissed her temple. "And you are exactly where you belong. Here, with me, always." Outside the window, spring had transformed Ashbourne's gardens. Flowers bloomed in riotous color. Birds sang in the ancient trees. Inside, Margaret stood in her husband's arms, her daughter sleeping peacefully nearby, and felt the truth of his words settle into her bones. She was home, not because of the grand house, not because of the title, but because she was loved. Truly, deeply, completely loved. And she had learned that love, real love, was worth more than any fortune, more than any title. It was worth everything. Margaret lifted her face and kissed Alexander, slow and sweet and full of promise. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you," he replied. "Every day, every moment, for the rest of our lives." And in that moment, Margaret Ashford, the invisible vicar's daughter who had once believed she would die alone and forgotten, knew with absolute certainty that she had found what she had been searching for all along. Not a title, not wealth, not society's approval, but a place where she was seen, valued, loved, a place where she finally truly belonged. Home.